Arena Death Punch. I love that band.
Well, the idea was to go fast and not spend a lot of time thinking about names.
All right. Well, welcome back to the AI Bot Show. I'm Carl Franklin. That is my friend Brian MacKay. And we've been away for a couple of weeks, I think, right?
Yeah, it's been 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
We've been busy, though.
Yeah, just busy with stuff. But we're trying to expand what we're doing here on the AI Bot Show into more code examples and eventually getting into more things that are more useful in business, right?
Yep. So for the last couple of weeks while we were off, I've been busy, among other things, with coming up with examples of things we can show that kind of get deeper into code.
Right. And so tell us what you've got here.
Okay. So I created.
Can we preface this with how crazy you are?
I'm a little crazy. It might be true. But this is actually something that I wanted to do for a bunch of reasons. And it happens that it's a really good entry point into showing a lot of the more interesting, powerful parts of how to use this technology. So what I've done is I created a game. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's less of a game and more of a simulation. But the thing to realize is that you're going to see a story, but the story is not just being generated by bots. We're not just saying, hey, make a story. There's a game engine. There's gladiators who are fighting, and it's interpreting what happens in the game into a story and not really making stuff up. Like the gladiators have a backstory. They have descriptions. All of that is like a sophisticated system of prompts using a technique called retrieval augmented generation.
All right, you're losing me here. Are these gladiators? Are these gladiators agents?
This whole thing is kind of like one big agent. Why don't we show the game?
Okay,
and then we'll talk about how I did it.
All right,
does that make sense? And so the thing to remember is everything you're about to see. It's not just telling a story. We're telling it. There are 2 gladiators. They have names. They have backstories. One of them killed the other one's brother, and they hate each other. That's all in there, and I'll show you how that gets in there and how we coerce all of that together to make this thing happen. I also did a lot of audio work.
Yeah, okay.
To try to make it more immersive. So here we go. You ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so Arena Death Punch. So this is
I love that band.
They're a great band. Yeah. It's too bad they broke up. Their early stuff was better.
Yeah, they would have stayed together if they hadn't killed each other.
That's the Death Punches. It gets you every time. All right, so here we go. Yeah. Fight.
The gates creak open. The battle begins.
The first part's a little longer. It can take a second.
Okay.
In the heart of the pit, Malleus and Garn stood opposed, their battle-hardened bodies casting long, ominous shadows on the gravelled floor. The spectators whispered amongst themselves, their eager eyes reflecting the drama unfolding below. Malleus, the brooding figure wrapped in vengeance, and Garn, the cruel victor, his old scars a glaring testament to many a brutal spectacle triumphantly endured.
Holy crap.
So see the game happening. Malleus punched him, and it's translating that now into narrative.
The story, okay.
Malleus's fist crashed into Garn's head, eliciting a grimace of pain and a scattering of hushed gasps from the spectators. "This is for Simon," he growled, his British accent echoing into the depths of the pit as blood trickled down Garn's face. Despite his injuries, the cruel gleam in Garn's eyes never faded. He was hurt, but far from defeated.
Should we have mentioned that this is NC-17?
With a swift lunge, Garn's fist arched towards Malleus's head, only to swipe at empty air as Malleus deftly sidestepped. Malleus's fist slammed into Garn's head again, his voice a rough whisper. Simon sends his regards. As the words hung in the dusty air, Garn crumpled limply to the ground, unconscious. The atmosphere within the pit grew still as the echo of Malleus's final words hung in the air. Garn's once formidable figure lay crumpled in the gravel, his cruel laugh now replaced by the stillness of unconsciousness.
So,
Oh,
the end.
wow. That's exciting.
It's something. I kind of want to
so-
turn this into like fantasy football with gladiators. I could see a whole thing.
So you said this is a speech engine?
Yeah. So there's a service called 11 Labs that I used for this, and we could go into some depth on 11 Labs itself. It is very, very easy to use and cool, and cheap. I think I'm paying $5 a month for this for 30,000 characters, which is plenty.
Wow.
For what I'm doing. And you can choose from a bunch of voices that exist. You can make your own. You can upload samples of yourself and use your own voice.
Oh, that's crazy.
It took me a little while to find somebody who could like have this kind of gravitas that I was after.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The British accent.
Yeah.
The deep voice. Yeah.
Yeah. And the ability to, like, importantly, being able to kind of be menacing with what they say is not something all the voices are made for.
Right.
Like this guy's able to be like, Simon sends his regards.
Yeah, yeah.
But most of them would say that in a kind of a much less interesting way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
all right, take us inside. What are you doing here?
All right, so I'm in Visual Studio here, zoomed way in, which is weird for me. Hopefully it looks good for the kids at home. But this is a console app. So my idea here was to go really fast and not get bogged down in things like graphics too much. I did do some graphics actually. I actually, console apps have more graphical capabilities than you'd think, and you saw some of them, like that Arena Death Punch, like the words. So I made this idea of scenes, which if you worked with game engines like Unity, they have scenes that kind of segment what happens. So there's an intro scene and a battle scene. So in the intro scene, you can see, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but you can kind of see the code for how I rendered that initial text in the menu. That's all like really easy to do with Spectre console, and the font that shows Arena Death Punch is nothing more than, there's this cool font called not graffiti, it's called a Figlet. Figlets know how to take normal text and write it with like ASCII. Yeah. So this really cool one called Graffiti is what you saw on Arena Death Punch. And I just kind of told it the colors to use. Did not spend much time on the name or any of that stuff. The interesting part is all inside the battle scene. So when you hit fight on that first menu, it takes you to the battle scene.
Okay.
And this is where all the magic is, okay? So what do we have here? Well, you know, you actually know this guy. I used in-audio for all the audio, and you've interviewed Mark Heath.
Mark Heath, yeah. Brilliant guy.
He's been on your show. Yeah, his stuff is good, but it's really low level. And I had to write my own audio engine out of it, because it doesn't actually just like play audio and just it's so much more low level than that.
It takes some code, yeah.
It does, but it turns out that GPT, with old libraries like that are well established, they've been around for a long time, it's great at helping you create things like that. So it was major help. There were some really complicated things like fading audio in and out, and like it a lot of the extension methods, it almost completely was able to write them. I don't think it could have just like extruded the entire thing, but little pieces at a time, I was able to put it together and make them all work independently. So anyway, that's more about audio than we really want. I made this narrator. This is the 11 Labs part. So
is that a narrator or a narrator?
Well, that depends, Carl. I think it's a narrator. All right.
Okay. That's fine.
So I need to zoom out so you can actually see. Maybe I can close the, I'll just move over so you can see what's going on. My lines are too wide for the window. I'll close this. All right. So I just have this method called speak. It takes text and a color. How do you speak a color? Well, this actually renders it asks 11 Labs to render the audio, plays it, and while it's playing, it tries to sync what's the typing that you're seeing. We're trying to sync that to the audio to be the same length. So these are a bunch of different IDs for different voices that I tried.
Okay.
We're using Silas, so you can just kind of see how easy this is. Like this is ANSI console stuff to make the little spinner happen, but this is just saying get this guy's Silas. This is his ID, and get me text to speech, and it returns a path, and then we just tell it to play that path. And I made a method that plays the audio and writes the text at the same time. So that's what the narrator
I noticed
does.
it was a little bit out of sync, but that's to be expected, right?
It did get out of sync. I feel like I could fix it if I tried harder.
Yeah.
I did not spend a lot of time on this.
Okay. I mean, it was good enough. I wasn't,
Yeah.
I wasn't sitting there like, come on.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels really good and natural when it works right, but this time it didn't work perfectly. So you can see there's a random number generator. This is just part of .NET.
Yep.
Called the RNG. This is Ouroboros client. That's how we talk to OpenAI. We've talked about that in other episodes. It helps with chaining and things like that. So now we start to get into the interesting stuff. Okay. Location fragment. Fragment is my own term. A fragment is a piece of a prompt. Okay.
Okay.
So this is just some text that it's going to render this into a prompt somewhere. And I'm just getting started. I'm initializing it. It's basically empty. We're going to put something else into it later and then use that to build up other prompts.
Okay.
Story Builder tracks everything that happens, all the text that gets emitted, also for the purpose of putting that into a prompt. Because when it's continuing the fight scene, we want it to know what happened before so that it can do things like not say the same thing twice, or Garn can respond to what the other guy's saying organically if he knows what the guy just said, right?
So it's sort of a history, right?
It is a history.
You're just appending strings to it.
Yeah. You have to remember, of course, that OpenAI doesn't know what happened just now. Like when the guy hits the other guy and you see the text, that's a prompt. Like, we're done. It's sort of stateless. OpenAI has no memory of that. So to make the next line of the fight happen, we have to build another prompt up, and it better include what just happened, or else it won't make as much sense.
I gotcha.
Make sense?
Yep.
All right. So when we call show, remember back here in program, we call show to start this, right? This is just my audio engine, which I should probably make this public. It's kind of cool. We play that crowd sound that's always in the background. People kind of,
right.
And I signed up for this for something called Epidemic Sound, I think it was.
Okay. Sound effects.
Yeah, sound effects and music. It's like $10 a month, and they have a month free trial. So all these sounds come from their library.
Very cool.
And they're licensed, and I'm able to use them this way. So this is a reference to the crowd, so that I can turn it. I make a reference to this one so that I can turn it up and down when voice audio is playing. You might not have even noticed, but as you probably know from all your audio experience, if the crowd didn't get quieter for the narrator to speak, it would sound weird. So
it would sound weird.
It actually fades it out and fades it back in.
That's very cool.
The fact that you don't notice too much means that it worked right. So we have this game state object. It's got a list of the gladiators in the fight and whether it's the first turn. That's all this has. So we tell it, hey, reset the game state, clear the story builder, and create the battle. And also create the narrator and play that drum sound at the beginning. Boom.
Yeah.
Boom,
right.
Boom. Just to make it more interesting while it's loading that initial big chunk of text. All right. So create battle. Let's go into this and watch how we make this thing. This is where we start to build out prompts.
Okay.
Part of the goal of this was also to push me. And to show the techniques that I use at work that are probably kind of boring and unrelatable for people on a show like this.
Right.
Okay, so I've made a template engine. So there's this fragment loader that I made, it basically just loads a file, a text file. I'm going to show you this. So it loads locationpit.md. What is that?
A markdown file.
It is a markdown file, Carl. So I
Thank you
find
very
that
much.
so far my favorite way to work with prompts is to save them as markdown files.
Mhm.
So in fragments, there's a list of all the markdown files, and
Mhm.
Fragment Loader knows where they are and how to load them. So
Got it.
location pit is this prompt. So the location is kind of a real thing. It's not just making it up.
Right.
The initial description, and this permeates everything that happens.
Got it.
So if it talks about, it might talk about somebody throwing dirt in somebody's eyes, or the environment in various ways. And I generated all this using OpenAI. So
Okay.
so now, like, a really cool technique is that if I wanted more environments, I could put this into a prompt and tell it to make me 20 and pick the couple that are cool and drop
Sure.
them in here. So there's techniques for that. All right. So we load this location fragment. And so this is just a string that contains this now. All right.
Right.
And this, if you know my work with pseudolang, is very suitable for dropping into a prompt. Like, this is part of a prompt.
Yeah. And it's also JSON, isn't it? Or it's close to JSON?
It's like,
It's JSON-ish.
pseudolang it's JSON-ish, and that is important. Pseudolang is not a real language. It's a pseudo language that OpenAI, that the GPT understands.
Mhm.
And JSON would work fine. And that's noteworthy because we actually use that in a minute. But put a pin in that.
Mhm.
So we load the location. We load this default wounds. I'm not really doing anything with this, but oh yeah, so this is actually an interesting thing. This one, so what do you think this is, Carl?
That's a placeholder for some other data. Wounds, which you're injecting in there somehow?
Yep. So this is a template engine. The fragments and another kind of template we're going to get to soon
Mhm.
both allow you to inject something into these mustache braces.
Nice.
So I didn't write that myself. There's an open source library for it that I just repurposed for this.
Okay.
So put a pin in that too, templates.
Mhm.
So here we create our two gladiators, and
Mhm.
you'll notice that a lot of the text that you saw was deeply informed by this. So Malleus and Garn, right? Malleus is lean and strong. He wears tattered rags and has dark skin. His hands are wrapped in whatever. Gallius is compact and muscular, and he's sadistic. He killed the guy's brother. They hate each other.
Yeah.
So we add them both to the game state. Fighter 1, Fighter 2, now they're in there.
Mhm.
All right, so let's go back to where we did this, where we called create battle. We create our narrator or narrator. We play our drums, doom, doom, doom. And then we say this part. This is static. He always says the gates creak open, the battle begins.
Okay.
And then this is how our prompts work. All right, this is where it gets interesting. So there's a prompt that contains. It's going to contain. Actually, I'll show it to you. All right. I think it's a combat template. All right. So this is a deeply templated template. There's a lot of substitutions here. But basically what you've got is all those things that we just looked at are getting injected in here. The location, the two fighters, the story so far, and the style. Style allows me to tell it, this one should be terse, this one should be longer, things like that. I could also say, like, write it all to rhyme, but we wouldn't want to do that. It's also terrible at rhyming, we've learned. It's simple. It's not what you want, for songs at least. So this becomes a user prompt. The two fighters square off and prepare to fight. And we're asking it to describe that. And this is going to automatically become the little spinning sort of waiting prompt to make it more interesting than just staring at a blank screen. And this tells it what the style is going to be.
Nice.
So when we go into this, write prose. Now we have to get into the templating technology a little bit to understand what I'm doing here.
Okay.
We just looked at combat template, and it needs all this stuff. Location, Fighter 1, Fighter 2, story, and style, right? So there's this, what you'd call a POCO object in .NET. It's just a normal It's
Plain
just a
old
regular
CLR.
old, plain old CLR object. Yep, nothing to it. It just has these things on it. Notice that these words perfectly line up with these substitutions, right?
Yeah.
So what I've done is I've created a template engine where you can make an object, name things, and then the strings just get plugged right in to the
Nice.
right brackets. This is actually much more powerful than just substitution. This mustache engine allows you to do looping and all kinds of stuff right here in the template.
Wow.
But I've never used that. So we create this combat options. The only one that you haven't really is there's two things here that are noteworthy. Style.toStyle fragment. So there's this enum writing styles that has terse and verbose in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I made an extension method toStyle fragment where depending on which one you choose, it loads a different fragment.
Okay.
So for instance, we're going to do verbose, which will be style verbose. And it just says write a brief paragraph. And every other note that I noticed on the way that needed to be in there, like use correct American spelling. Sometimes it was doing typos or weird British stuff. Don't have to look at that much more.
No offense, British people.
Yeah, you just want it to be consistent. British is fine. All British or all American, one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in this part's interesting. So you mentioned that pseudolang is a lot like JSON.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with JSON.net, you can convert any object, if it's serializable, into JSON.
Right.
So these gladiators are serializable.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got it set up so that only the properties that I ask for get serialized. So I put these attributes on all the properties that I want to have serialized.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to just turn these into a chunk of JSON that is just about the same as pseudolang. And they just pop right into these holes and they work great.
Cool.
All right. So then we get into the Ouroboros-y stuff and the template engine. All right. So we say new up a combat template. This is just code that kind of wraps. There's not much in here. It's just this. I made this, and it's just a wrapper around the. It kind of just refers to this. So the idea is
the options. Yeah.
Yep. If it's called combat template, it's going to belong to the markdown file called combat template.
Mm-hmm.
It'll automatically load it with no extra configuration, and it knows that the options it needs is combat options. So that's all this does. It's very simple. If people want it, I can open source it. This knows how to convert the template into different kinds of messages. So if you've worked with the Batalgo API for OpenAI,
which we haven't even talked about.
Not really. No, it is the best of the APIs for C# for GPT that I'm aware of.
Okay.
You would do something like this. Like this is basically Batalgo here. Chat message is one of their objects, and you would normally have. Actually, this is what you would normally have: chat message dot from user, and then you pass in a message. Well, you could
Where's
say
that chat message defined again?
This is part of Batalgo.
Batalgo, OpenAI object models, request models, chat message. Okay.
Yep. So if you do it by hand, which is what this is, you say chat message dot from user means we're creating a user message, right? There's system, user, and assistant are the three different kinds of messages.
Just like we saw in the playground earlier.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're getting into more advanced things here. So you're going to start to have concepts thrown at you that if you haven't played around with this a little bit, you'll start to get very lost. But system is usually the first prompt, and it tells this thing kind of who it is and how to act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that first combat template, there's a way to say, like my template engine, you can just say as system and it renders it as a chat message, a system message, and you pass in the options. So this is just building up the messages, and that message we passed in back here, like you can kind of see, I don't know if that's too small. I'll go back into it. The two fighters square off from prepare to fight. becomes the
Right.
user message. So
Okay.
when you put it together, it's saying, hey, you're this thing that describes stuff. You write based on what I tell you to write. That becomes the system message, and then describe the two fighters squaring off becomes the user message, and then it's going to give us a good response. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then we say write chat messages, which just does that. Actually, don't even worry about this. This is for debug mode.
Okay.
I made something so that if I want to see exactly what's being sent to OpenAI, like the prompts themselves, I can make it emit that stuff for debug purposes, but debug mode is off, and so you didn't see that. All right, going back. So we've got our messages here.
Yep.
And then we send them to OpenAI. And in ANSI console, which is part of the Spectre console API, you can make this spinner really easily, and you can say, spin while I do something. And so we're going to say spin while we send these messages to OpenAI.
A green star.
A green star. That's right. There's all kinds of options.
Right.
Again, the goal was not to spend a lot of time on graphics, so I just said green star go. I think that was an example that I copy pasted somewhere.
Nice.
So when this line executes and it finishes, the response object goes into this variable, and we continue. So then we check to see if it was successful, which it almost always is. And we add the text to the story builder so we can build up the story and remember it for future prompts. And then we return
the string builder that's just taking strings, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
We add another line to it. And then we return the text that was generated.
Cool.
So I'm going to go back to where we came from, which is here. And now we have this intro text, which is that big initial intro that says, oh, here's this awesome pit, and these two guys are like this, and they come out and fight.
Right.
So I make the drums fade out. This is part of my little library I made. So
to half
fade to zero over half a second.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that's the drums that go doom, doom at the beginning. We want them to stop at this point. And then we play this like drum hit, like this big type sound.
Right. I remember this.
Yep. And then we make the narrator speak the intro, which we looked at how the narrator works. It's going to try to type as he speaks,
right,
and end at the same time. All right. So then as we start our game loop. All right. So I'm going to go down a little bit here, and this is kind of fun. So the gladiators take turns acting, and there's not a lot of things they can do yet. But the way a do while loop works is this will keep running in an infinite loop until one of them is dead.
Right. Okay.
So we run while they're both alive, while they're all alive.
And I just have to mention here that I think the whole point of this is that the outcome will be different in every fight, right? Every time you run this, it could have a different outcome.
Yeah, and it's all determined by the simulation.
Right. But it is random. I mean, like the first gladiator isn't going to kill the second one every time.
Right.
Right.
Like they can dodge sometimes. You can see different things.
I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
So see what happens.
Yeah, this will actually, right now we're going to get into the gaminess of it. Okay, so we're just going to go into how they take their turns, all right? So take turn gladiator. So this is where the gaminess of this thing really happens. This is a simulation where these guys fight, and they have hit points, and it's the beginnings of a more sophisticated game where you can train your own gladiators, and then they go into an arena and you see who trained best. With different moves and maybe armor and weapons and things like that. It could get a lot more interesting than sort of the boxing thing we have going on now. But the idea is we get the first person who's not us. Like this is the guy taking the turn, right?
Yeah.
So we want to get our enemy. And then this is all really thrown together to be a very simple game engine.
Sure.
We have a couple places where you could punch somebody. I used my weighted selector library that I created a long time ago to make it so that like you're more likely to hit them in the head, but you could also hit them in the body about half the time or a third of the time.
Okay.
This is actually
Right.
how I met you, Carl. This library was what we went over when we were first talking.
Wow. Long time ago.
Long time ago. That's right.
So at the heart of it is a randomizer.
Yeah,
Right?
there's randomness all over the place for this part. So we figure out where the guy's trying to punch, if he's going to talk. So if it's the first turn, the very first person who goes will always say something because it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mhm.
we pick a number between 0 and 1, I think is how this works.
Mhm.
And this code gets very dicey here. Basically, I think if it's a 2, they hit. No, if it's a 2, they miss, and if it's anything else, they hit. So they'll
Got it.
block or dodge like 30% of the time, 33% of the time. So basically, if they dodge, we get this type of thing. They throw a punch, but they dodge. If they're speaking, there's some extra text that goes in there to tell it to say something.
Mm-hmm.
And if they hit, this happens. We decrement their health by 1. We do some languagey stuff to figure out how severe the attack was. Like we want to build a prompt up that says like, oh, he really got mauled by that. He's in bad shape now. And that all gets built into this. I'll scroll over so you can just kind of see what's happening with this. But we build up this mini prompt that it tells it who's punching who, where they hit them, how bad it was,
Yep.
whether they're speaking,
Right.
and after that, what shape they're in. So it could be like after that, he's barely standing. That's a potential thing for wounds. And this all gets fed into our writing engine. It gets the message and it writes about it, and the narrator speaks it.
That's pretty simple.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. And then when the game is over, let's go back to where we came from here. So when someone has 0 health, which is what this means, the winner is the first one who's alive. We play applause, we fade the crowd out over 10 seconds, and we write some more text and we read it. And we play another hit.
This is pretty cool.
I'm trying to show that GPT is not always chat. The most interesting places where I've used it in real business situations were not chat. It was, and I really wanted to do some more sophisticated things here, but I ran out of time. I wanted to be able to have another prompt that takes the text that gets generated and says, does this do anything to the sound? Like, did we just say that the crowd hushed, you know? Because if we did, I could fade the crowd to like a low volume. Or if there's some other sound, I could pull it from a sound library and play it. And that's a good example of like using like a little mini agent that knows how to like analyze text and figure out a command from it and then execute a couple different kinds of commands. I still want to do that, but hopefully this showed more sophisticated uses of GPT.
It's very cool, Brian. And I can't wait to sort of get into how we can use the GPT API in sort of real world business scenarios. But this should get the gears rolling, you know, for the people watching this. How can I use this in my situation? You know,
I hope so.
Very cool. Yeah. All right, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks,
See you
Carl.
next week.